Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night settles over the silent empires, where danger moves quietly and the toughest men earn their names in silence, not spotlight. Tonight, we turn to William Billy Bats Bentvena, a made man whose sharp wit, unshakable pride, and old-school loyalty carved his place deep into the New York underworld. His legacy wasn't built with noise, but through reputation, respect, and a presence that could fill a room even when he barely spoke a word. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and tell us your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these quiet, shadow-lined stories alive through the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Billy Bats guide you deeper into the quiet. Picture a small bar in Queens on a warm night in June. The room smells of beer, cigarettes, and cheap cologne. A jukebox plays an old rhythm and blues tune, the kind that makes people talk louder to be heard. Men in short-sleeved shirts lean over the counter, swapping stories. Glasses clink, dice roll on the back table, and underneath the noise there's a quiet tension that nobody admits out loud. Near the middle of the bar stands a man in his late 40s, compact, dark hair combed back, a careful smile on his face. He has just come home after years behind walls and bars. People clap him on the back, press drinks into his hand, tell him they're glad to see him back on the street. He acts like he believes them. He laughs. He jokes. He reminds one of the younger men about the days when that kid used to shine shoes on a Brooklyn corner. At another end of the bar, a younger man stiffens at that remark. His eyes narrow for a heartbeat, and then smooth over. Nobody else seems to notice, but the air shifts. Just a bit. The man fresh out of prison doesn't feel it. He's caught in the warm glow of being free, of hearing music without a guard yelling, "Lights out," of seeing faces not framed by steel. If you could freeze the scene right there, in that second before words turn into grudges and grudges turn into something worse, you'd be staring at the end of a long road. That road began far from that Queens bar, decades before, when the same man was only a boy in a loud Brooklyn tenement, learning how respect and fear could look almost the same. To understand how he ended up in that crowded bar, smiling at men who did not all wish him well, you have to go back to the beginning of William Billy Bats Bentvena. He was born in Brooklyn in 1921, the child of Italian immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic, chasing work and stability. They carried with them little more than a few bags, a dialect from the old country, and a belief that if they worked hard enough, their children might live a better life than they had known in cramped villages back home. The streets where he grew up were tight and noisy, tenements pressed against each other, laundry hung between windows on ropes. Children played stickball in alleys and shouted up to mothers leaning out of kitchen windows. A parish church's bells marked the rhythm of the day. On Sundays, families filled the pews, asking for protection in a city that did not always welcome people with foreign names. Money was always short. His father found labor where he could, on docks, in warehouses, sometimes in construction. His hands were rough, his back tired, but he carried himself with a seriousness that made his children straighten up when he entered a room. His mother kept the home running, cooked big pots of pasta and beans, tried to stretch every coin. For families like theirs, the line between surviving and going hungry was thin. Brooklyn in those years carried the shadow of prohibition, even after the laws had changed. Many older boys and men in the neighborhood knew somebody in the rackets. You could tell them by their suits that fit a little better than everyone else's, by the cars they drove, by the way people stepped aside when they walked down the sidewalk. They drank espresso in small social clubs where the curtains stayed half closed even on bright afternoons. Kids grew up watching them and learning that there were different kinds of power in the city, the kind written in law books, and the kind enforced by men on street corners. Young William, like many boys in that world, learned early to read people, which grown-ups had tempers, which storekeepers could be sweet-talked for a little extra candy, which men to respect, not because they were good, but because ignoring them was dangerous. It wasn't the kind of education written in school notebooks, but it mattered more than arithmetic on many blocks. When the Great Depression hit, already thin paychecks shrank or disappeared. Some fathers were out of work for months. Breadlines appeared. Kids went without new shoes. In that climate, the men at the social clubs didn't seem to struggle the same way. They still had money for good jackets, for drinks, for helping a neighbor cover a doctor's bill if that neighbor was willing to be grateful later. That mix of fear and gratitude wrapped around the local underworld like a cloak. As a teenager, William did the usual jobs, running errands, shining shoes, delivering groceries. But he also began doing small tasks for the older boys who hung around the clubs. At first, it might have been nothing more than carrying a sealed envelope from one street to another, or standing outside a card game and warning if a stranger was coming. Little things that let him feel he was part of something bigger. These early tasks connected him to the larger structure of organized crime that had been growing for years. In New York, Italian-American criminal groups had already organized themselves into what came to be called the families. These weren't families in the usual sense, but tightly structured organizations with bosses, underbosses, captains, and crews. They thrived in places where police were underpaid, politicians were open to favors, and communities often felt caught between distrust of authorities and dependence on local toughs. William's neighborhood fell under the influence of one of these families, the one that would decades later be known as the Gambino family. Back then, names and leadership shifted, but the basic idea stayed. A network of men controlling gambling, loan sharking, labor rackets, protection schemes, and, in time, narcotics. For a boy like him, the path into that world was rarely dramatic. There was no single day when he suddenly joined. It happened bit by bit. An older man might say, "Kid, you want to make a few dollars?" That was all it took. A few extra dollars in your pocket when your family had nothing could feel like a miracle. The price for that money would come later. He proved useful. He kept his mouth shut, paid attention, didn't make scenes. In neighborhoods where gossip traveled fast, a boy who could keep quiet gained trust. Over time, he moved from errands to more serious roles. He collected money for local bookmakers, visited apartment doors to pick up bets on numbers, dropped off envelopes in back rooms of candy stores that doubled as neighborhood offices for the rackets. By his late teens, organized crime was shifting from the wildness of Prohibition-era gangs to a more disciplined structure. The Cosa Nostra, our thing, as it was called among insiders, expected loyalty and obedience. Violence was certainly part of that world, but it was usually disciplined and calculated, not random. The men at the top wanted stable income, not constant street wars. William's generation came of age during World War II. Some young men in his circle put on uniforms and went overseas. Others stayed in New York and kept the money machines running. Records about his own military service are unclear, and like many lower-level figures of that era, much of his life was not recorded in public files until law enforcement took serious interest in him. What is clear is that by the post-war years, when returning soldiers were looking for work and families were moving to new boroughs and suburbs, he was already tied to people who operated beyond the law. As the city changed, he followed opportunity. The racks of industry shifted from docks and warehouses to airports and trucking routes. Crews learned how to skim from cargo shipments, fix bids on contracts, squeeze new kinds of businesses. Local bars, clubs, and social rooms remained vital hubs for these operations. William moved among them, often working out of such places, handling gambling action, watching over investments, enforcing debts. In time, he became attached to the crew of Carmine Fatico, an important figure who ran operations in East New York and later Ozone Park. Fatico's crew specialized in schemes around the airports and in neighborhood rackets. Among the men under Fatico was a younger, aggressive hoodlum named John Gotti, who would much later rise to national fame. At the time, though, they were just hungry street and mid-level men, carving up pieces of Queens and Brooklyn, looking to rise in the organization. Within that circle, William was not a loud personality. Accounts from later years describe him as serious, businesslike, not a show-off. He avoided drawing attention from police, which in that life was almost as valuable as making big scores. He handled gambling interests, invested in bars and clubs, and engaged in loan sharking, lending money at very high interest to people who had nowhere else to turn. When borrowers fell behind, reminders came quickly. That reminder might be a quiet visit, a warning, or if needed, a rougher nudge. The goal was always the same: protect the income streams. Those activities were crimes, of course. Running unlicensed betting, manipulating card games, threatening or intimidating people who owed money. All of it broke the law and harmed victims who were often desperate or vulnerable. But in the neighborhoods where he moved, such things blended into the background of daily life. People knew that if you sat in certain basements and played dice, the house took a cut. If you borrowed from certain men, you didn't miss payments. If you did, trouble arrived quickly. Through the 1,950 seconds, organized crime drew more attention from newspapers and government committees. Hearings in Washington interviewed mob informants and tried to shine light on how these families operated. On the streets, though, the day-to-day routine barely changed. Men still gathered in social clubs behind frosted glass. Money still flowed from bookmakers, Shylock loans, and stolen merchandise. Police and federal agents had limited tools, and many within the community still preferred to turn to their own for help rather than to authorities. At some point in those years, William took an important step up. He was formally inducted as a made man in the Gambino family. The exact date and details remain murky, as such ceremonies were secret. But later testimony and law enforcement files agree that by the 1,960 seconds, he was not merely an associate but a full member. That change meant several things. He now had formal protection. Other associates could not lay hands on him without permission from high up. It also meant greater responsibility. He was expected to earn money for the family steadily and to take part, when called upon, in decisions and actions that might include serious offenses. Being made did not erase the risks of that life. If anything, it deepened them. A member knew inner workings, knew who controlled which rackets, which politicians might be pliable, which law enforcement officers might be sympathetic. That knowledge made them valuable, but also targets if things went wrong. Yet for many in that world, the prestige outweighed the danger. Coming from poor immigrant streets, to be recognized as a fully initiated member of a powerful organization felt like a kind of arrival. By the early 1,960 seconds, William "Billy" Batts, Bentvena, stood at that point. He had climbed from cramped Brooklyn childhood to a place where he wielded influence in his slice of New York's underworld. He had money, contacts, and the backing of one of the city's strongest crime families. But the same path that raised him also tied him to darker corners of that life, corners that would, in time, lead him toward that crowded Queens bar, the tense laugh, and the danger he didn't see coming. The early 1,960 seconds put a new shine on New York. But under that surface, the same old machinery kept turning. For William "Billy" Batts Bentvena, middle-aged by then, the days followed a pattern that would have looked ordinary to anyone who lived in his circles, and strange to almost everyone else. Morning might begin with espresso in a small kitchen in Brooklyn or Queens, sunlight coming through a thin curtain, a radio low in the background. A wife or relative moved around the stove, neighbors heading to regular jobs, garbage collectors, mechanics, clerks passed by the window. He did not rush out the door at the same hour every day, because his work did not come with a time clock. His schedule was set by bookmakers' sheets, weekly payments, sit-downs, and the rhythm of the streets. Most days he visited social clubs and bars that doubled as informal offices. In East New York, and later Ozone Park, those places were the heartbeat of Carmine Fatico's crew. Old men played cards. Younger ones stood against the wall, watching and listening, hoping to be noticed. A fan hummed in the corner. Cigarette smoke curled under low ceilings. The television might show a ball game, but nobody really watched. William moved through those rooms quietly. He was not the one telling loud jokes or banging his hand on the card table. He was a presence. Someone people recognized and nodded to. "How you doing, Billy?" He'd answer in a calm voice, never giving away too much, always weighing what was said back to him. His income drew from several streams. He had money in gambling operations, illegal card games, bets taken on sports, wagers on daily numbers. The law considered all of it criminal. In his world, it was referred to simply as the action. Bookmakers logged bets in coded notebooks or kept everything in their heads. Runners brought cash from bars, candy stores, barber shops. At some point, that cash would be counted in a back room, a share going to the house, another to the family, the rest spread among the men who kept the enterprise running. He also lent money at steep interest. People came to him when banks would not touch them, small business owners behind on payments, gamblers in deep, workers who had made a string of bad choices. They would sit with him at a table in a club or a quiet booth in a bar, explaining how they just needed a little help to get through the week or the month. He would listen, weigh the risk, then decide. If he agreed, the terms were harsh but clearly stated: miss payments, and there would be consequences. Everyone knew what that meant, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. Federal agents later described him as a reliable earner, someone who brought in steady income for the Gambino family. In the strict hierarchy of that structure, reliability mattered. Boss Carlo Gambino valued men who did not draw attention, who kept money flowing and problems to a minimum. William fit that mold. He handled business, appeared where he needed to be, avoided chaos. Carmine Fatico, the captain he answered to, ran an important crew. Fatico oversaw bookmaking, truck hijackings, and cargo theft, especially around the airports that were expanding in Queens. Idlewild Airport, later renamed JFK, became a goldmine for organized crime. Warehouses full of electronics, clothing, liquor, and other goods passed through every day. If a few crates went missing, there were always explanations, paperwork shifts, distracted foremen. Behind those mistakes stood crews controlled by men like Fatico. William did not personally climb into trucks and drive away with stolen shipments. Younger associates handled the physical work, but he helped coordinate, finance jobs, and arranged where stolen goods would be sold. If a truck disappeared one night and, a day later, new televisions appeared in a certain neighborhood for very low prices, it wasn't hard to trace the outline of these schemes, even if the details stayed hidden. In Fatico's orbit was a younger man who stood out. John Gotti. Broad, shouldered, quick-tempered, ambitious. Gotti had grown from a street thief into an enforcer and hijacker. While William carried years of experience and a calm manner, Gotti embodied the new generation, restless, eager to push, sometimes reckless. The two men operated in the same world, one older, one younger, bound by the same chain of command. They became close. Accounts from later investigations and informant testimony place William and Gotti side by side in various rackets. They were seen together at clubs in Ozone Park, at warehouses near the airports, at meetings where money and favors changed hands. To younger associates, seeing the two together sent a clear message. This was a partnership worth respecting. Officially, the Gambino organization claimed to reject one particular trade: narcotics. Bosses spoke often about the danger of drug dealing, the long prison terms that came with it, the attention it brought from law enforcement. Some leaders issued firm orders that their men were to avoid it completely. On paper, that stance was unambiguous. Reality was messier. The profits in narcotics were enormous, especially compared to traditional gambling or loan sharking. Heroin in particular brought in huge returns. A man who could move even modest amounts through a network of street dealers might earn more in a short time than he could from years of numbers running. That temptation proved too strong for many. They entered the trade through side doors, using intermediaries, hiding their involvement as best they could. Somewhere in this changing landscape, William stepped into that field. Federal files and later media accounts agree on one central point. He became involved in a heroin distribution conspiracy and was eventually convicted for it. Details in public records are sparse, but the basic structure of such operations at the time is well known. Shipments often arrive from overseas, sometimes via Europe, concealed among legitimate cargo. Packages were broken down into smaller units and passed to trusted mid-level figures who could distribute them further. Those men rarely touched street-level dealing themselves. Instead, they financed others, kept ledgers, and collected proceeds. Their protection came from silence, from layers of separation between themselves and the final customer. Investigators with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and other agencies had been watching the Italian-American underworld's role in heroin for years. By the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, they began using more wiretaps, informants, and long-term surveillance. They followed cars from social clubs to apartments, watched handoffs in parking lots, listened to conversations in code over payphones. Occasionally, men picked up on the trail and changed habits. Many times they did not. In William's case, his name surfaced in the context of a broader probe, one that targeted several individuals believed to be mid-level organizers in a heroin network. Agents built a case piece by piece, intercepted conversations, informant statements, observed meetings. When they believed they had enough, they sought indictments. The day of his arrest did not look different at first. It might have been one more afternoon stepping out of a club, heading toward a car double-parked outside. Then plainclothes agents closed in. To passers-by, it would have appeared as just another arrest in a city full of them. Men flashing badges, firm hands on an arm, a quick, efficient search for weapons. Within minutes, he was in the back of a government car, the familiar streets moving past the window in reverse. At the federal building, he was fingerprinted, photographed, and led into a holding cell. The charges, when read, were serious. Conspiracy to distribute narcotics, violations of federal drug laws that carried stiff penalties. He had seen others go through similar ordeals. Some beat the charges. Others disappeared into prisons for years. Bail hearings, meetings with attorneys, consultations with other defendants followed. In that world, even legal strategy had unwritten rules. No one wanted to be the one who talked too much, who shifted blame in a way that could be seen as betrayal. Silence and unity, at least in public, were expected. Behind closed doors, each man weighed his own risks. The trial, when it came, drew less public attention than high-profile cases involving bosses. But within law enforcement circles it mattered. Prosecutors presented tapes, surveillance reports, testimony from cooperating witnesses. Defense lawyers challenged the evidence, questioned credibility, pointed to gaps. Sitting at the defense table, William listened, his face giving away little. Years in the underworld had taught him that showing fear or anger in court never helped. In the end, the jury convicted him. A federal judge, bound by mandatory guidelines of that era, imposed a significant sentence. For William, it meant trading the crowded rooms of social clubs for the controlled, regulated world of a federal penitentiary. By most accounts, he would spend about 6 years there before release. Prison life followed its own strict order. Days were measured by counts, work assignments, meal times. The population included bank robbers, drug traffickers, fraudsters, men from every corner of the country's underworld. Some had ties to the same families that ran New York streets. Others came from unrelated criminal networks. Numbers and codes that had meant one thing in Brooklyn took on new meanings on cell blocks hundreds of miles away. As a made member of the Gambino organization, William carried a certain standing even behind bars. Men who shared that background often stuck together, offering protection and mutual support. They played cards, walked the yard, shared news from home. Letters came from relatives and associates, carefully worded to avoid attracting too much attention from prison censors. He kept to the same approach he had followed on the street. Quiet, observant, non-dramatic. He did not cause problems for guards, did not involve himself in obvious disturbances. Staying out of the spotlight helped him move through his sentence with fewer complications. The unwritten rule remained: never cooperate with authorities, never reveal internal workings, never break the code that bound his world. Outside, the life he had known moved on without him. Carmine Fatico's crew continued to handle gambling, hijackings, and loans. John Gotti's reputation as a tough enforcer grew. Younger associates filled gaps left by imprisoned men, running errands, collecting, stepping into roles that once belonged to older figures. Money that would once have passed through William's hands now passed through others. News traveled in bits and pieces through letters and through conversations with inmates who arrived after new arrests. He heard about changes in leadership, new rackets at the airports, investigations by federal authorities. He would have known that Carlo Gambino's power within the national underworld had solidified, that the Gambino family remained one of the most influential in the country. For a man like him, prison years offered time to think. Some inmates used that time to reconsider their choices, to imagine a different path. Most in his position, bound tightly to the culture of the organization, did not. They saw the sentence as an occupational hazard, a cost of doing business. The expectation was clear: serve the time, keep silent, come home, resume earning. That pattern had repeated for many before him. At some point near the end of his term, word came that he was scheduled for release. The exact date, like many details in his life, drifted into rumor and conflicting accounts. But people on the outside knew roughly when to expect him. In Ozone Park and nearby neighborhoods, Men who had once answered to him talked quietly about his return. There were questions about which rackets he might reclaim, how money and territories would be adjusted, what favors were owed for the years he had spent locked away. Among those paying attention was John Gotti. Their friendship and business ties meant that Gotti had a personal interest in seeing him settled comfortably back into the life. A man who went away without complaining or cooperating was owed something upon release that was an unspoken rule. It preserved trust. If people saw that those who kept quiet were abandoned, the whole structure would weaken. When the day finally arrived and William stepped through the gates back into open air, he was no longer young. The world outside had changed in visible ways. Cars looked different. Fashions had shifted. Even the skyline had evolved. Yet certain things were exactly as he had left them. Social clubs still served as gathering spots. Illegal gambling still flourished. Money still moved through hidden channels, from working-class pockets into the coffers of the families. He returned to neighborhoods where his name still carried weight. Old acquaintances greeted him with warmth, some out of genuine affection, others out of careful respect. He had done what was expected, taken a fall, kept his mouth shut, and come back. In that world, such conduct counted for a great deal. Plans began forming around how he would re-establish himself. There was talk of interests in bars and lounges in Queens, places where he could base gambling and loan operations, where people could come to pay respects and, if they were smart, keep on good terms. For a man just out of prison, those first nights of freedom, hearing music in a crowded room, holding a drink without a guard watching, must have felt like a return to a familiar version of life. What he could not see, and what no one in his circle fully grasped yet, was that the underworld he was stepping back into had changed in subtler ways too. Younger men were more volatile. Old rules were fraying at the edges, and the careful balance between different families could be upset by a single insult in the wrong bar on the wrong night. When William walked back into the life after those years in federal custody, he stepped into a city that looked familiar, but did not feel exactly the same. The faces in the social clubs had changed. Some of the old-timers were gone, dead or retired or locked up for good. Younger men had taken their places at card tables and along the walls, wearing sharper suits, talking a little louder, showing off more than the older generation had liked. The core structure he knew was still there. The Gambino organization remained powerful. Carlo Gambino still sat at the top. Carmine Fatico still controlled the crew tied to Ozone Park and the airport rackets, though law enforcement pressure had increased. John Gotti, once a rough street thief, was now a trusted enforcer, already carrying himself like someone destined to rise higher. For a made man like William, that continuity meant there was still a place to land. His first weeks of freedom followed a pattern anyone from his background would recognize. Relatives cooked big meals. Old neighbors dropped by to shake his hand. Men from the life came to see him, one or two at a time, to show respect and to signal that they had not forgotten what he had done, gone away, kept quiet, and come back. In that world, a man returning from prison was expected to be welcomed, at least outwardly, as someone who had upheld the code. He resumed visiting the clubs and bars that served as his base. In Ozone Park and nearby neighborhoods, small storefronts with dark windows still housed back rooms where cards were played and money was collected. Conversations picked up where they had left off years earlier. Which bookmakers were reliable? Which small businesses were behind on payments? Which new opportunities had opened around the airports or in construction? One visible difference was the amount of federal attention on narcotics and organized crime. The same kind of heroin dealings that had sent him away were now at the center of national campaigns. New laws had stiffened penalties. Task forces combined agents from different agencies. Wiretaps were more common. Many men in his shoes, whatever they felt privately, told themselves they would be more careful about that particular business in the future. Still, his reputation in that area did not disappear. Law enforcement summaries from later years continued to describe him as someone who had been part of a narcotics conspiracy, as well as gambling and loan operations. On the street, people knew his history. Some saw him as a man who had taken a heavy fall. Others, particularly the younger, more reckless figures, quietly wondered if the old caution against drug trafficking really meant anything anymore, now that so many had been tempted by fast profits. In day-one-day terms, he returned mainly to what he knew best: bookmaking, loans, and investments in nightlife spots. Bars and lounges had always been a natural fit for men in his position. They provided a legitimate front, a place to meet, and a steady stream of customers interested in gambling or in need of short-term cash. The line between lawful business and criminal activity blurred inside those rooms. One of the places where his world intersected with another New York organization was a Queens bar known as The Suite. On paper, The Suite was a regular nightclub. People came there to drink, dance, and listen to music. Behind the scenes, it also served as a hub for betting and loans, run by men tied to the Lucchese family, including Henry Hill and James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke names that would later become widely known through books and film. Hill and Burke were not members of the Cosa Nostra in the formal sense. One was Irish-American, the other half-Irish, and the rules of the Italian-American families at that time did not allow non-Italian men to be formally inducted. They were, however, trusted associates in the Lucchese network, particularly under capo Paul Vario. Burke, in particular, had earned a reputation as a capable earner and as a man unafraid of violence. The criminal underworld in New York was divided among several families, but the lines were not walls. Men from different groups sometimes cooperated on hijackings, gambling, or other ventures, as long as income flowed smoothly and boundaries were respected. That meant someone like William, a made man in the Gambino family, could do business and socialize with Lucchese associates, provided everyone knew who answered to whom. By the time William came home from prison, Burke and Hill had been operating The Suite for some time. It was, according to later testimony, both a hangout spot and a center for their rackets. They used it to take bets, arrange deals, and meet people who needed loans. For a man like William, who had spent years away, a place like that offered a ready-made environment to reconnect with the street. There was another tie. During his earlier years in the life, he had known a younger man named Thomas DeSimone. Tommy, as everyone called him, came from a family involved with the Lucchese side. As a kid, he had done odd jobs around wise guys, including shining shoes for older men. By the late 1960s, he had become an associate in Burke's crew, impulsive, feared, and unpredictable. The memory of that kid's shining shoes would later matter far more than anyone imagined. When word spread that William was out and back in Queens, a welcome home gathering was arranged. In the retelling of these events by Henry Hill and others, that gathering took place at the Suite. The picture that emerges from those accounts is vivid, even if not every detail can be verified in official records. It was a warm night in June, 1970. The bar was crowded. Music played from a jukebox. People drank, laughed, smoked, and congratulated the man who had just come home from a long stint. To many of them, he represented the old way of doing things. Keep your mouth shut, serve your time, rejoin the life. Drinks were bought in his honor, hands were shaken, jokes traded. Among those present, according to Hill, were Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill himself, and Tommy DeSimone. The mix of people in the room reflected the overlapping circles of New York's underworld Gambino and Lucchese associates together under one roof, bound by money and mutual interests more than by labels. Accounts from that night agree on one key scene. At some point in the evening, Tommy approached or was near William, and conversation turned to the past. The older man, perhaps a little drunk, made a remark reminding Tommy about his days as a shoeshine kid. The exact wording has been repeated many times in books and movies, though there is no way now to know precisely how it was said. What matters is that Tommy took it as a serious insult. In the world they lived in, public respect meant everything. Gentle teasing among friends was accepted, but reminding a man in front of others that he used to shine shoes for, you could be heard as a way of putting him in his place. From William's perspective, it may have been a harmless, even affectionate reference to the past. From Tommy's, who now saw himself as a feared up-and-coming figure, it was humiliating. Different people in the room registered that moment in different ways. Some barely noticed. Others sensed the tension immediately. Henry Hill would later describe how Tommy's face changed, how his mood darkened. Those recollections, offered years later under the protection of witness programs, form much of what the public now knows about that night. William, for his part, does not appear in any surviving account as someone looking for trouble. He was there to celebrate his release. There is no record of him threatening anyone or making demands. His life until then had been built on his ability to navigate these rooms, to balance pride and caution. Yet on that night, with one comment, he stepped into the blind spot of another man's anger. Understanding what followed requires understanding how strictly boundaries were supposed to work. Within Cosa Nostra culture, a made man was owed a high level of protection. An associate, someone not formally inducted, could not lay hands on him without approval from the very top. Doing so would be seen not only as an offense against the individual, but as a challenge to the entire structure of that family. Tommy DeSimone knew all of this. Everyone in that circle did. It was drilled into them from early on. You never touch a made guy unless the command comes from above. That rule kept violence under some kind of control. It meant disagreements could be settled in meetings, through mediation, instead of erupting into constant retaliations. And yet, as the 1,960 seconds gave way to the 1,970 seconds, younger figures like Tommy pushed harder against those limits. Fueled by ego, cocaine, and the belief that they could get away with anything if their own bosses backed them, they sometimes took actions that older generations would have avoided. William's tragedy lay in the path of that impatience. After the tense exchange in the suite, witnesses remember that Tommy was seething. Jimmy Burke, more calculating, understood both the insult and the danger of any rash response. He knew William's status. He knew how intertwined the families were, how carefully disputes usually had to be handled. For the rest of that evening, open hostility did not erupt. Drinks kept flowing. Music played. People drifted in and out, but a seed had been planted in Tommy's mind. A feeling that he had been publicly belittled by someone he no longer wished to see above him, in the informal pecking order. That feeling would not fade. It would grow into a decision that, by every traditional rule, should never have been made without higher approval. For William, the days right after that gathering likely felt like any other early days of freedom. He resumed his familiar routines. He discussed potential investments in bars and clubs. He checked in with Gambino superiors, who would have wanted to hear directly from him and to see that he was healthy, loyal, and ready to earn again. He probably felt that, after doing hard time, he had proved himself. Behind the scenes, though, forces were shifting. In that neighborhood, in that moment, there existed a tight but fragile web of interests. Gambino men connected to Fatico and Gotti, Lucchese associates under Burke and Vario, old loyalties from childhood, new resentments born in a single drunken conversation. William could see the web from his side. He knew where he stood in it. What he did not know was that at one of its edges, a hot-headed younger man was preparing to tear a hole straight through it. Law enforcement agents who later tried to reconstruct these events worked mostly from the testimony of Henry Hill, who eventually agreed to cooperate to avoid long prison terms. Court documents, debriefing reports, and Hill's own memoir outline what he claimed happened next. There are no court transcripts with William's own voice about those last days. The story of his end comes filtered through others, through their memory and their motives. Still, one thing is certain and supported by police and FBI files. Not long after that welcome home period, William Bentvena disappeared. He stopped being seen at clubs and bars. He did not show up for routine meetings. Family members could not reach him. In the records of the New York Police Department and federal investigators, his name shifted categories from active subject in Gambino-related files to missing person, presumed victim of an underworld killing. The gap between that warm night in a Queens bar and the cold bureaucratic line disappeared, believed murdered, is where his story turns darkest. It is also where, because of the secretive nature of that world, much must be pieced together from fragments, rather than stated as if every moment were documented on film. What emerges from those fragments, however, is grim enough on its own, even without lurid detail. After that June evening, people saw less and less of William. At first, nobody thought much of it. In that world, men sometimes disappeared for a few days without explanation. They went out of town on business, lay low if they felt heat from the police, visited relatives without announcing it. But as days turned into weeks, his absence became harder to ignore. At the social clubs where he had been a regular presence, chairs he usually occupied stayed empty. Bookmakers who expected to settle up with him instead handed their envelopes to others. When his name came up in conversation, people shrugged or changed the subject. In that culture, sudden silence around a topic often said more than words. Family members tried calling places he frequented. The answers were vague. He was here the other day. Haven't seen him, he must be busy. Behind those non-answers, people sensed something had gone wrong. In a normal community, a missing middle-aged man might prompt newspaper notices, appeals, a public search. In this one, the first instinct was to keep everything inside and away from the authorities. Reporters did not write about it at the time. Local papers were full of other crimes, strikes, elections, celebrity news. A Gambino wise guy vanishing without a discovered body did not break through to front pages. On police paperwork, his name entered the system as another adult reported missing, with a note about suspected organized crime ties. Years later, when Henry Hill chose to cooperate with federal agents rather than spend the rest of his life locked up, he filled in much of what had happened. His account, repeated in interviews, trial testimony, and a memoir, is the main source for what we think we know about Williams last night. Hill had reasons to present events in ways that helped him, so no outside observer can treat every line as absolute fact. Yet investigators, comparing his words with other fragments, judged the broad outline credible. According to Hill, after that strained welcome home party at the suite, Tommy DeSimone could not let go of his resentment. He brooded over the remark about shining shoes. To someone like Tommy, eager to be seen as a feared figure and sensitive to any perceived slight, the comment felt like a public demotion. He wanted to make a statement that no one, not even a made man from another crew, could talk down to him. Tommy, Hill, and Jimmy Burke allegedly planned to attack William in a setting they controlled. The suite provided that space. It was their place, where they chose who came in the side door, who stood near the bar, who waited in the back room. On the night they picked, Hill said, they arranged for William to stop by again, as if for more drinks and talk. Hill described how they tried to keep the mood casual at first. Music played, a few regulars moved in and out. Conversations were light. William, relaxed after his recent freedom and still trusting old faces, had no reason to imagine a trap. Years spent navigating dangerous environments had not prepared him for one crucial change: that someone would break the most basic internal rule and lay hands on a made man without higher clearance. At a moment they had chosen in advance, as Hill later told it, Tommy suddenly attacked. He used a blunt object taken from behind the bar, striking fast. The goal was to overwhelm before the older man could react. Jimmy joined in. Hill said he himself, caught between fear and loyalty to the crew he depended on, helped restrain and then helped with what followed. Though he portrayed himself as less directly violent, they believed they had ended his life there. In that room where he had been celebrated days earlier for keeping silent and serving time, he now lay motionless on the floor. The decision to attack him, if Hill's account is correct, had not been cleared with Gambino leadership. From the standpoint of Cosa Nostra rules, that made the act not just a killing, but an unauthorized execution, affecting relations between entire organizations. The three men moved quickly. According to Hill, they wrapped William's body, carried it out of a side entrance, and placed it in the trunk of a car. One of the reasons organized crime homicides proved so hard for police to solve was this practice of removing remains from the scene, leaving behind no obvious crime location, sometimes not even a missing person report right away. Without a body, an investigation often stalled before it began. Hill claimed that, on the drive away from the city toward a rural burial spot, they heard sounds that suggested William might still be alive in the trunk. Startled and frightened, they pulled off the road to check. What followed, in Hill's telling, was more violence, meant to ensure there would be no one left to identify them later. He spared some specifics in public descriptions, and law enforcement summaries, when quoting him, did as well, but the meaning was clear. Whatever faint chance William had of survival ended there. They then continued to a property connected to an associate, in an area where no one expected police to be roaming at night. Hill said they buried the remains there, covering the disturbed ground, and planning never to speak of it again. In their minds, they had eliminated a perceived insult and removed a potential problem, though they had also, whether they fully grasped it or not, committed an act that would echo inside their own world for years. Sometime later, Hill said, the man who owned that property decided to sell it. The burial spot, once hidden on lightly used land, might soon be under the eyes of new owners, surveyors, even construction workers. Faced with that risk, Burke and his crew, again according to Hill, returned to the site. Under cover of night, they dug up what was left and moved it to another, more permanent hiding place. allegedly under a structure connected to Burke's own operations, where piles of scrap metal and junk would make casual exploration unlikely. No remains officially identified as Williams have ever been recovered. Law enforcement personnel have at times searched properties mentioned in informant interviews, but decades of development and environmental change complicate such efforts. Without physical evidence, investigators built their case out of statements, circumstantial details, and patterns known from similar disappearances. In the neighborhoods where William had lived and worked, rumors spread quietly. Some whispered that he had been straightened out for disrespect. Others that he had been caught up in an internal dispute. People speculated about who had ordered it, or whether it had been a rogue act. In those circles, however, gossip rarely crossed the line into open accusation. Saying too much about a missing made man could bring trouble to your own door. Within the Gambino organization, the fact that a member had vanished after conflict with outsiders could not be ignored. But proving exactly what had happened, and by whose hand, was another matter. The only direct witness from that side of the underworld who later talked at length was Henry Hill, and he belonged to a different family's orbit. Over time, another story began to circulate, one that linked Williams' case to a later disappearance. In 1979, nearly a decade after William went missing, Tommy DeSimone himself vanished. He told people he was heading to a meeting. He never came back. No official charges were ever filed in his case because no body surfaced. But among law enforcement analysts and former mobsters, the prevailing belief is that he was killed. Many who studied these events believe Tommy's disappearance was, at least in part, punishment for what he had done to William. A Gambino member killed without authorization, especially by an impulsive associate from another family, represented a serious insult. Under traditional rules, that could not go unanswered. There are theories that Gambino figures such as John Gotti played a role in arranging Tommy's end, but no court has ever confirmed a single version. If that interpretation is correct, then Williams' last night set in motion another chain of events years later. The same violation of the code that doomed him may have led in time to the man who attacked him meeting a similar fate. In that sense, the underworld's internal balance eventually reasserted itself, though in an invisible and ruthless way. Meanwhile, Jimmy Burke continued his career. During the 1,970 seconds, he orchestrated a series of major thefts and schemes, the most famous being the Lufthansa cargo heist at JFK Airport in 1978. Federal documents and later trials tied him to hijackings, killings, and large-scale fraud. Hill, part of that same circle, took part in the Lufthansa planning and later turned state's witness, revealing details of many crimes, including what he said had been done to William. On the law enforcement side, investigators slowly assembled the puzzle. Separate investigations into the Gambino and Lucchese organizations brought in informants, wiretaps, and seized records. In debriefings, former insiders described missing men, including William, as having been killed on orders or out of personal grudges. Agents cross-checked stories, timelines, vehicle records, old arrest sheets. By then, however, years had passed. Memories blurred. Physical traces had long since disappeared. Prosecutors have to meet a high standard in court. Guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. With no recovered remains, no crime scene photographs, and only the word of criminals seeking reduced sentences, bringing formal homicide charges in Williams' case proved impractical. What did appear instead were broader racketeering indictments that treated individual killings as part of patterns of organized crime. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, introduced in 1970 and used more aggressively in the 1,980 seconds, allowed prosecutors to show juries how repeated acts extortion, theft, loan sharking, violent attacks formed a criminal enterprise. Names like Burke and Gotti ended up in these sweeping cases. Williams' disappearance became one thread among many, evidence of the kind of internal enforcement that held those enterprises together. For William himself, there was no public funeral, no grave with his name carved in stone. Whatever private rituals his family observed, they had to do so without a casket. On underworld lists maintained quietly by investigators, charts connecting names, crews, and families, he shifted from active to deceased, presumed, body, not recovered. His life, measured from a Brooklyn childhood in the 1,920 seconds to that June night around age 50, traced the classic arc of many mid-century organized crime figures. He had come from an immigrant household with limited options, entered petty rackets young, climbed into a formal crime family, and become involved in gambling, loans, and eventually narcotics. He had gone to federal prison under tough drug laws, served his time without cooperating, then returned expecting to resume his position. He did not live to see how the structures he served would begin cracking under pressure. He was gone before the full force of RICO cases hit in the 1,980 seconds, before televised footage showed bosses led away in handcuffs, before witnesses in bulletproof vests testified at length about the rules and rituals that had once been so closely guarded. He never saw John Gotti rise to boss, embrace media attention, and then fall to a life sentence. He never saw Henry Hill on talk shows, describing in detail the very night that had ended his own path. The story of William "Billy Bats" Bentvena that the public now knows is therefore uneven. His early years, his exact role in particular rackets, even elements of his personality, are sketched only in outline by scattered references. His death, by contrast, has been replayed and dramatized in books and film, with actors and scripted lines standing in for a real human being, whose last conscious moments happened in a dimly lit Queens bar and on a dark roadside. Pulled back to its essentials, though, his story is not cinematic. It is a straightforward account of cause and effect in a closed world. He chose a life in which disputes were settled by force and in which loyalty to an organization outweighed loyalty to almost anything else. He rose by those rules, profited by them, and, in the end, fell victim to someone else's decision to ignore some of the same boundaries that had once protected him. For the communities he moved through, his absence altered little on the surface. Social clubs stayed open. New men took over old rackets. Envelopes kept changing hands. To someone walking down Liberty Avenue or through Ozone Park a year later, there was no visible sign of his disappearance. That quiet replacement of one face with another was, in many ways, the most telling feature of that life. Individuals could be here 1 month, gone the next, with the machinery of the organization continuing to run. Yet inside the files of detectives and federal agents, his name stayed. Case summaries mentioned him whenever investigators mapped ties between the Gambino structure and the Lucchese crew around Jimmy Burke. His earlier narcotics conviction appeared in compilations of mid-level drug traffickers tied to traditional organized crime. His unauthorized killing was cited, in training materials and confidential reports, as an example of how personal ego could destabilize even well-established criminal groups. By the time Henry Hill's stories entered popular culture, William's fate had become known far beyond the blocks where he had grown up and worked. Viewers saw a dramatized version of him in a film, recognized only as Billy Bats, and watched an on-screen assault based loosely on Hill's telling. For many, that was their only introduction to the man. The real history behind that brief, violent scene, decades of small choices, minor crimes that became major, the fine line between respect and insult remained mostly in the background, half hidden, much like the life he had actually led. Long after William vanished from that Queens landscape, his story still existed somewhere, not in living rooms or barstool talk, but in paper and ink. In file cabinets at police precincts and in federal buildings, his name appeared in typed lines, stamped forms, and handwritten notes. Those pages, dry and official, told another version of his life, the one seen from the other side of the street. The earliest traces were small. A young patrol officer in Brooklyn might have stopped him with a group of neighborhood boys hanging outside a closed storefront late at night. A report might note loitering, suspicious persons, and then list names, including his, before ending with released. In those days, such incidents rarely led to charges if no one had been hurt and nothing stolen. But they created a pattern on paper. Here was a young man who often appeared alongside people already known to detectives. As he grew older and more involved, the reports changed tone. One might describe surveillance on a suspected illegal betting parlor above a candy store, with a short, dark-haired man seen entering and leaving at regular hours. Another might detail a raid on a backroom card game, where several men were caught with ledgers and stacks of cash, everyone claiming they were just playing for fun. Names were checked, some men given minor gambling summonses. For the police, it was routine. For William, it was a hint of how closely his activities were being watched. In the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, gambling arrests rarely led to long sentences. City courts were crowded. Juries were not always eager to treat policy numbers or card games as major threats, and defense lawyers knew how to argue that their clients were harmless. Many bookmaking cases ended with fines, short county jail stretches, or suspended time. That leniency allowed men like William to treat such arrests as part of the cost of doing business. Prosecutors saw him as a mid-level operative, not the man at the very top giving the orders, and not a low Y-level runner taking bets on street corners, but someone in between, trusted to handle money, to supervise others, to make sure envelopes reached captains like Carmine Fatico. His name began to show up in the middle of organizational charts that investigators sketched on large sheets of paper, boxes for bosses and underbosses, lines down to captains and soldiers, smaller boxes for associates. His square sat under the section for the Gambino Group, around the East New York and Ozone Park area. Information came from many places. Some neighbors, tired of seeing the same men outside certain clubs, would call an anonymous tip line. A bartender angry over an unpaid loan might quietly tell a detective who had shaken him down. Once in a while, a low-ranking associate, facing prison and feeling abandoned, would agree to talk. These informants would mention names, describe routines, explain which bars belonged to whom. In that mix, William's role took shape for investigators. They wrote that he helped oversee card games in specific locations, that he collected interest payments on short-term loans to small merchants, that he had relationships with longshoremen and truck drivers who moved goods from docks and warehouses. Some reports linked him to strong arm activity, a polite phrase for making sure people who owed money did not forget their obligations. Yet for years, much of what he did remained just out of reach for the law. Witnesses were afraid. Jurors did not always trust the word of criminals against other criminals. Cases built on surveillance alone often collapsed under the weight of technical challenges. He was questioned multiple times, picked up in sweeps, held overnight, and released. Each time he walked out of a station house, he had one more reminder of the thin line he walked. The turning point came when federal authorities shifted focus toward narcotics. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and other agencies had begun mapping out heroin routes from overseas into American cities. They knew that traditional organized crime groups, particularly some Italian-American families, played a bleat role in importing, cutting, and distributing the drug. Their goal was to climb the ladder from street sellers up to organizers. In the late 1952, they launched a series of long-term investigations in New York. Agents sat in unmarked cars near social clubs, tracked who met whom at coffee shops, and listened at payphones with court-approved wiretaps. They tailed couriers between apartments and warehouses. They recorded coded conversations, discussions of shirts, tickets, or suits that in context clearly referred to heroin packages, not clothing or sporting events. William's name surfaced in this context, attached not just to gambling, but to meetings with known narcotics figures. Surveillance logs might show him arriving at a restaurant, spending an hour in a back booth with someone already linked to heroin deals, then leaving with a folded newspaper that suddenly seemed thicker than before. Informants, hearing of his new activities, quietly told their handlers that he was now putting money into drug distribution. Building a drug conspiracy case required connecting many small events. Agents assembled charts showing dates, locations, car license plates, recorded phone calls. Piece by piece, they convinced a grand jury that certain men, acting together, were moving heroin through the city. Indictments followed, naming multiple defendants. Among them, William Bentvena. The formal charges were dry legal text violations of federal narcotics statutes, conspiracy counts, references to specific sections of the United States Code. Behind those lines lay months of undercover work. Arrest teams moved in on multiple suspects in a coordinated sweep, hoping no one would have time to warn others. For William, used to being questioned and released, this arrest looked different from the start. The agents had thick case files. They were not there just to ask a few questions and let him go. During pretrial hearings, prosecutors outlined their evidence. Phone intercepts, suggesting negotiations, surveillance, placing him at key meetings, testimony from at least one cooperating participant in the ring. Defense lawyers tried to poke holes in the chain of proof, arguing that mere presence at a location did not prove involvement, that coded language was open to interpretation, that informants were unreliable. Judges weighed motions to suppress certain tapes or searches. When the case reached trial, The courtroom scenes contrasted sharply with the noisy clubs he was used to. Instead of low-voiced card games under a whirring fan, there were neat rows of benches, a judge in robes, a jury sworn to listen. Federal agents took the stand, describing months of patient observation. Interpreters explained how code words were commonly used among traffickers. An admitted participant in the scheme, trying to reduce his own sentence, pointed across the room and identified William as a man who financed shipments and shared in the profits. For a long stretch, William sat at the defense table, listening to people he had once dismissed as marginal now telling stories that could cost him years of his life. He consulted with his lawyer, occasionally leaned forward to study a document, but by most accounts he displayed the same controlled demeanor he used in street dealings. Losing composure in court helped no one. The jury eventually returned guilty verdicts on the main charges. In that era, federal narcotics laws carried mandatory minimum penalties. There was little room for leniency based on age or prior record. When the judge pronounced sentence, it reflected not only the acts proven at trial, but the government's larger effort to make an example of organized crime figures entering the drug trade. Imprisonment for narcotics was different from short local stints for gambling. It meant transfer to a federal facility, often far from home. It meant years, not months, under constant supervision. It meant sharing space with a broader mix of offenders, from bank robbers to tax cheats to others, locked up under the same drug statutes. Inside, he followed the unwritten rules of men from his background. Do your time without complaining. Stay close to others from similar circles. Avoid cooperation with the authorities. Prison officers noted his name in rosters, recorded his work assignments, logged any minor infractions. To them, he was one more inmate among many, identified by a number. To the Gambino organization on the outside, he remained a made member temporarily sidelined. While he served his sentence, his criminal record thickened. In addition to earlier local entries gambling charges, Question Dajan released notes, mentions in intelligence reports, he now had a major federal conviction. Future investigators looking back at his file would see a clear picture. A man who had moved from neighborhood rackets into high-risk, high-profit narcotics activity, and who had paid a significant price for that choice. Yet, through the lens of his own world, the story looked different. Among fellow mobsters, his narcotics conviction did not mark him as an outcast. Despite official denials about drug dealing from some bosses, many privately accepted or even encouraged their men's involvement, as long as it brought in money and did not provoke too much attention. What mattered more to them was that he had remained silent. He had not taken the stand against anyone else. He had not cut a deal with prosecutors to walk away early. That silence preserved his standing. After his release and return to Queens, his official record slowed. There were still occasional mentions in police intelligence notes, seen in company of known Gambino members, present at suspected gambling location, but no new major arrests. From the viewpoint of a detective flipping through an index of subjects, he was an older figure, already tagged as a narcotics convict and Gambino member, presumably back in the mix, but not immediately at the center of the newest cases. Then came his disappearance. Reports of a missing adult, particularly one with organized crime ties, rarely led to swift resolution. Detectives would check hospitals, speak quietly to informants, call other agencies. They would add his name to lists of suspected underworld homicides where no body had been found. They would note his last known whereabouts as a Queens bar and the approximate date he was last seen alive. When Henry Hill later cooperated, agents pulled out those old files. They added Hill's statements about the suite, the argument, and the planned ambush. They drew lines linking William's name to those of Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone. They attached copies of his prior conviction to show that this was not an ordinary missing person matter, but part of a pattern of violence within connected groups. From a purely investigative standpoint, William's record told a familiar story: early involvement in street-level crime, steady climb into structured organized crime activity, expansion into narcotics, significant prison time, and eventual disappearance under circumstances that strongly suggested an internal settling of scores. His known crimes: bookmaking, loan sharking, likely extortion, and participation in a heroin conspiracy, fit squarely within the typical portfolio of a mid-century New York wise guy. What remained unknowable, even to the agents who studied his case for years, were the details of countless smaller acts that never made it into a report. Every unpaid debt he had pressured, every card game he had supervised, every frightened borrower he had leaned on, left marks on lives but not necessarily on paper. People remembered being told to pay up or else, but few were willing to put that memory in writing or share it in a witness box. In the end, those traces of his actions survived more vividly in the communities he passed through than in official archives. A shop owner might recall the day two men came by with a suggestion about protection. A bartender might remember how the presence of certain figures in his place meant easy nights with big tips followed by sleepless hours worrying about police raids. A cab driver might remember occasional lady-night runs for him to out-Widgeaway meeting spots. All of that formed the submerged part of his criminal life. The daily, repetitive exertion of control and extraction that kept the money flowing to him, to his crew, and to the higher-ups who sponsored them. While the narcotics case put a formal label on a particularly serious set of crimes, the fabric of his existence in that world was woven from many smaller threads. By the time his name began to appear in public books and articles about the mob, long after his death, those authors leaned heavily on the documents the police and federal agencies had preserved. They wrote about his conviction, his known affiliations, his status as a Gambino soldier, and the reported circumstances of his killing. They drew on Hill's depiction of that night in Queens. They added context from larger histories of the Gambino and Lucchese organizations. As a result, the picture that reached readers decades later showed both the official and the underground sides of his record. On one hand stood the list of documented offenses: participation in organized gambling, involvement in high-interest lending, federal narcotics conviction. On the other stood the day-to-day enforcement and intimidation that were never fully cataloged, but that gave those enterprises their real impact on ordinary people. In the years after William was gone, his name lingered in certain corners of New York like a half-remembered story. Older men in Ozone Park or East New York, sitting on folding chairs outside social clubs in summer, might say "bats" quietly and then fall silent, glancing around before changing the subject. Younger people often knew only fragments. An uncle who used to drive for him, a father who warned them never to gamble in particular bars because those places belonged to Billy. What they were talking about, without spelling it out, was a very specific kind of working life that had shaped whole blocks of the city for decades. William had been part of that from his youth, an unofficial economy sitting on top of the regular one, using the same streets, the same corner stores, the same back rooms. On the surface, he looked like many other neighborhood men. He wore suits, usually dark, with crisp white shirts. His shoes were polished. He didn't flash jewelry the way some younger guys later did. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew almost everyone on his route. People greeted him politely. Some smiled warmly. Others forced a smile because it was expected. Behind those ordinary greetings lay the tangle of his day offenses. Bookmaking sounds simple, but it required organization. In those years, before digital betting, lines on games came in by phone from bigger operations or local line services. Runners took bets in taverns, candy stores, barbershops, taxi stands. They wrote them down on slips or memorized them, then reported totals to a central figure. A man like William often sat at the center of such a small network. He would decide how much action he was willing to hold on a game, when to lay off some risk with another bookmaker, how to collect from winners and losers. On a Monday morning, after a weekend of football, he might know dozens of people who either expected an envelope from him or dreaded seeing him appear in a doorway. Players knew the rules. If they won, they got paid quickly, which built trust and encouraged them to keep betting. If they lost and had the cash, they settled up without argument. If they lost and didn't have the money, that was where his other line of work began. Loan sharking depended on people being desperate or overconfident. Interest rates in that underground market could be punishing. A borrower might hand over a fee every week just to keep the principal from growing, never really reducing the debt. When the payments stopped, William or someone working for him would show up in person to talk sense into the debtor. Violence always stood in the background of those conversations, even when it was not used. A quiet sentence in a doorway, "You don't want problems, do you?" carried decades of reputation behind it. The knowledge that he belonged to the Gambino structure made that implicit threat heavier. To many small shopkeepers and gamblers, the choice felt like paying him or risking trouble not just from one man, but from an entire network. He did not operate alone. In Fatico's crew, tasks were divided. Some men concentrated on hijacking trucks and moving stolen goods. Others specialized in labor rackets on the docks or in construction. William's strengths were money management and people control. He knew how to keep accounts in his head or in coded notebooks, how to spread risk, how to resolve small disputes before they turned into big ones. Around the airport, his name came up in connection with cargo schemes. In the 1,960 seconds, warehouses near Idlewild and later JFK were packed with valuable freight. Electronics from overseas, clothing, liquor, small appliances. Workers on the inside, from forklift operators to clerks, were often underpaid and susceptible to offers. Crews tied to Fatico would learn which shipments were lightly guarded, which routes had gaps in patrols, when a driver might be willing to look the other way. William's role, based on law enforcement intelligence, was more about coordination than direct theft. He helped fund operations, arranged buyers for stolen goods, and took a share once everything was sold through fences as discount merchandise. When a truck's contents disappeared between terminal and destination, official paperwork might list a mechanical delay or a routing error. Behind the scenes, enough people were paid that no one asked too many questions. All of this activity was criminal, even if, on the surface, it did not look as dramatic as movie scenes of robberies. The real damage came from the constant pressure on legitimate businesses and workers. A small trucking company losing a load could go under. A store owner paying protection might never invest in improvements. A gambler sunk in debt could drag his family down with him. The step into heroin dealing raised the stakes. Unlike gambling or even loan sharking, narcotics had immediate, obvious victims in every neighborhood. Users showed the damage in their faces, their families, their stolen property. The mid-century heroin pipeline that investigators called the French Connection moved drugs from Turkey to France and then to United States ports, including New York. Groups like the Gambino organization provided contacts, storage, and distribution. William's particular case placed him at the mid-level of that chain. He was not out on corners selling capsules. He was not the transatlantic source. He stood somewhere in between, putting up money, arranging safe locations, and making sure shipments moved smoothly through his side of the city. His earlier experience with bookmaking and collections translated easily into this new, more dangerous commodity. Inside the Cosa Nostra culture, heroin was officially forbidden. Bosses spoke of it as bad for business. They warned members that if they got caught dealing drugs, they could bring harsh attention on everyone. Yet profits proved hard to resist. Quiet exceptions were made. Men like William found themselves in the contradictory position of serving leaders who condemned narcotics in public meetings while benefiting privately from the money it brought in. His conviction in that field did not, as far as records show, lead to his expulsion from the Gambino group. On the contrary, the fact that he took the full sentence and did not implicate superiors confirmed, in the eyes of many, his reliability. When he returned, even with a drug case on his record, he was treated within that circle as a man who had done what was expected. That loyalty flowed both ways, at least in theory. As a made member, he believed he could rely on the organization for support. While he was in prison, others from his crew would help his family if needed. Once he was out, he would be given room to re-establish his rackets. People who had filled in for him were supposed to step back or share earnings. The code insisted that no one take permanent advantage of a man's absence due to incarceration for family business. This expectation made what happened later all the more striking to outsiders trying to understand. An associate from another family's orbit attacking him, without an order from the Gambino command, was a clear breach. That breach exposed the tension between an older generation and the impulses of newer figures like Tommy DeSimone. William belonged to that older stratum. His formative years in the life came under leaders who prized low profiles and discipline. Carlo Gambino was almost invisible to the general public, preferring quiet influence to flashy displays. Men like William copied that style. They dressed neatly but not extravagantly, kept their voices down in public, avoided clubs that catered to attention seekers. By the late 1,960 seconds and into the 1,970 seconds, some younger men were pushing a different image. They drove flashier cars, wore more noticeable jewelry, spent big in nightclubs where musicians and minor celebrities appeared. They were less patient with the slow climb through the ranks. Quick scores and bold moves appealed more than measured, long-term strategy. William's friendships reflected the bridge between those worlds. On one side, he had ties up the chain to Fatico and Gambino. On the other, sideways links connected him to people like Jimmy Burke and, indirectly, Tommy. These sideways links were both an asset and a risk. They opened doors to joint ventures, shared gambling spots like the Suite, but also meant that a problem in one circle could spill into another. John Gotti sat at a crossroads of these trends. When William first knew him, Gotti was a young, tough street enforcer, still figuring out his place. Over time, he absorbed aspects of both approaches. He understood the value of traditional Cosa Nostra discipline, but he also enjoyed attention, nice clothes, and being recognized. For William, Gotti was both a personal friend and a symbol of how the organization was changing underneath the surface. Many later accounts suggest that Gotti was outraged when he learned that William had been killed without approval. Within Underworld channels, arrangements were likely made to settle that violation in a way that restored the Gambino group's sense of control. Those arrangements, as with most internal punishments, left almost no trace on paper, but the timing of certain disappearances, including Tommy's, lines up too neatly to be pure coincidence in the eyes of most analysts. If you look at William's career as law enforcement historians do, you see it as a case study in how organized crime operated from the 1,940 seconds into the early 1,970 seconds. He started with low-level street tasks, moved into steady gambling and loans, reached a formal place inside the Gambino system, branched into narcotics, did federal time, then fell victim to violence at the hands of associates. If you look at it from inside his community, you see other layers. You see a boy from a poor immigrant household who found a path to money and status that seemed more attainable than college or corporate work. You see a man who, by middle age, could walk into almost any bar in certain neighborhoods and be treated with deference. You see someone many residents feared, yet, in a complicated way, some also relied on for loans when banks said no, for quick resolutions to disputes, for a kind of rough order that existed separate from the official one. None of that excuses his offenses. The borrowers he squeezed, the families hurt by heroin he helped distribute, the workers endangered by cargo thefts, all bore the cost of choices he made and systems he supported. But it explains why those choices made sense to him and to so many of his contemporaries. The combination of illegal income and community standing created its own feedback loop. A small success in gambling led to better clothes and more visibility, which led to more opportunities to lend money and recruit helpers, which led to deeper entanglement in the organization. Stepping out of that loop voluntarily was rare. Once you were in, especially as a made member, walking away could be seen as betrayal or weakness. By the time he reached his late 40s, his role and identity were fully formed. New laws and investigative tools were closing in on his world. But from his perspective, that world had always had police at its edges. He had spent decades adjusting, shifting locations, tightening his circle when heat rose. The string of past arrests followed by releases likely convinced him that he could navigate whatever came next. What he could not anticipate was that the threat would come not from a grand jury or a wiretap, but from a volatile younger man whose sense of pride outweighed his respect for the usual chains of command. In that sense, his downfall was not only the result of his own history of crime, but also of a generational shift within the mob, one that combined the old capacity for violence with a new impatience for protocol. In later years, criminologists and organized crime experts sometimes pointed to his case when talking about how fragile the internal rules of even a tightly structured criminal syndicate can be. All it took was one associate, ignoring long-standing boundaries, in a fit of temper to disrupt relationships between entire groups. The cost of keeping order then rose. More meetings, more retaliatory acts, more risk of informants. William never lived to see that larger unraveling. His story ended in 1970, at a time when the surface calm of traditional families still held. Within 15 or 20 years, that calm would be shattered by mass indictments and televised trials. The secrets he had protected with his silence in court ended up being laid out by others wearing wires or testifying for the government. From a distance of decades, it is easy to see his life only as background for someone else's narrative, a plot point in the tale of Jimmy Burke's crew. or a memorable scene in a movie. But behind that shorthand, Billy Bats, was a real history. Years of small daily steps into deeper involvement. A long record of non-violent and violent wrongdoing. A loyalty to a criminal brotherhood that he believed would, in turn, shield him. In the end, that shield failed when it mattered most. The same system that had given him protection and power for so long could not prevent an unauthorized act in a corner of Queens. It could respond afterward, perhaps, by arranging consequences in its own way. It could preserve its dignity in the eyes of its members. It could not restore his life or give his family a grave to visit. What remained were memories in a handful of neighborhoods, references in police files, and his place in the wider history of New York's underworld, a figure whose real existence was complex and whose end, as far as anyone outside that world can now be sure, was as stark as the life he chose had always made possible. Years later, in a quiet office far from Queens, an investigator pulled a worn folder from a cabinet. On the tab, typed in fading ink, was the name Bentvena, William, aka Billy Bats. Inside lay a life reduced to pages, arrest sheets, surveillance notes, summaries of interviews, and, clipped on top, a newer report stamped with a recent date. That top sheet came from a debriefing with a federal witness, Henry Hill, who, after years inside the Lucchese orbit, had finally decided to talk. For the agent reading, the story on those pages linked two very different eras. In the older documents, William appeared as another mid-century wise guy, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, ties to Gambino figures like Carmine Fatico and John Gotti. In the fresher statements, he was the man in a Queens bar whose argument over a shoeshine comment ended in an unapproved killing. Between those two sets of papers lay the whole arc of what had happened after he vanished. When William disappeared in 1970, the Gambino organization could not simply shrug and move on. A made member was supposed to be under the family's protection. If he died, it was supposed to be by formal decision, for reasons discussed and approved by higher-ups. Here, if Henry Hill's account was accurate, an associate from another crew, Tommy DeSimone, had taken it on himself, with Jimmy Burke's encouragement, to eliminate a man who had rank and standing. Within that hidden world, such an act required a response. It likely began with quiet conversations. Gambino men close to William would have gone to their leaders, explaining that he had gone missing after a dispute at a Lucchese-connected bar. Word would have reached people around Carlo Gambino and, below him, those managing crews in Queens, including John Gotti, who had long known William personally. On the Lucchese side, Paul Vario's crew around Burke controlled places like the Suite. When questions came their way, they would not have admitted to anything outright. But everyone understood what the disappearance meant. A meeting, what mobsters called a sit-down, was almost certainly arranged. Representatives from both families would have gathered in a private setting, perhaps the back room of a restaurant, perhaps a small apartment. Voices low, no outsiders present. They would have worked through what could and could not be admitted, who was owed, and what had to happen next to keep the larger peace. Those negotiations rarely made it into any logbook. No transcripts exist. What historians and retired agents believe, piecing together patterns from many cases, is that Burke and DeSimone's crew were judged to have broken an important rule, even if some Lucchese higher-up eventually gave post-facto cover. The Gambino side still felt a debt was owed. Years later, when Tommy himself disappeared on his way to a supposed meeting, many in law enforcement saw it as the delayed settling of that account. While these underworld maneuvers played out, William's family lived a different, more public kind of uncertainty. Days passed with no word. Then weeks. At first, they might have been told he was away on business or lying low. Those phrases had always floated around his world, code for stretches when someone needed to vanish for a while. But as time stretched on, they became harder to believe. At some point, someone, perhaps a relative outside the life, went to the police and filed a missing person report. An officer took down his name, age, physical description, last known location, known associates. The form would have a box checked for possible organized crime involvement. Detectives might make a few calls, ask informants whether anyone had heard something. The replies were vague shrugs, half-whispered hints that he'd run into trouble. Nothing solid enough to build a case around. For his immediate family, there was no clear moment of closure. No phone call from a hospital, No visit from uniformed officers bearing final news. Just a gradual shifting from hope to resigned belief that he was gone. Bills still needed paying. Children, if he had them, still needed to be fed and sent to school. Whatever income he'd provided had to be replaced, often by people with far fewer options than he'd had. In daily life, the absence settled into quiet routines. A chair at a kitchen table stayed empty. A coat hung on a hook long after it should have been taken down. Relatives debated how much to tell younger members of the family, whether to say he had died or simply that he had gone away and was not coming back. In Italian-American households of that era, such conversations often ended with a sigh and a gesture upward. Dio sa, God knows. Out on the street, rackets he had controlled did not remain unclaimed. Other Gambino figures stepped in to handle his bookmakers, his loan accounts, his stake in certain bars. Collections were redirected. Debtors were told to pay a new face. For the organization, the priority was keeping income flowing, not preserving a dead man's personal portfolio. In that sense, he was replaced almost immediately. His position in the network filled in like water filling a gap in a stream. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was turning a broader corner. The 1,970 seconds brought new tools and a shift in focus at the federal level. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, allowed prosecutors to treat groups like the Gambino and Lucchese outfits as criminal enterprises and to pursue leaders for patterns of behavior rather than isolated acts. Under RICO, a man who ordered crimes could be held just as responsible as the one who carried them out. FBI squads dedicated to organized crime expanded. Agents no longer looked only at single hijackings or lone drug busts. They built long-term cases, mapping relationships, tracing money, placing bugs in clubhouses and meeting spots. Undercover operations sent agents into warehouse jobs, union offices, even small trucking outfits, to get closer to the everyday functioning of these networks. In those investigations, names like Burke, Vario, and Gotti appeared often. Charts on squad room walls connected them to known associates, including men who were by then missing or presumed murdered. A red mark beside Bentvena indicated his disappearance. A note might read, "Last seen at Burke Run Bar, believed victim of intra-homicide." It was one line among many, but it signaled that agents saw his case not as random, but as part of a structured pattern. Then, in the late 1,970 seconds, came the Lufthansa heist, a massive theft of cash and valuables from a cargo terminal at JFK. Burke played a central role. The robbery drew huge media attention and intense federal scrutiny. Over the next few years, one participant after another disappeared, presumed killed by Burke, or under his orders, as he tried to tie off loose ends. That trail of bodies, combined with older unsolved cases, increased pressure on anyone who had ever been close to him. Henry Hill had been that close. He had helped plan the Lufthansa job. He had worked with Burke and DeSimone for years. By 1980, facing the likelihood of a long prison stretch on drug charges and fearing he would be the next to vanish, he chose a path that William had refused when he stood trial years earlier. He agreed to become a cooperating witness. Over months of debriefings, Hill sat with FBI agents and federal prosecutors, telling them what he knew. He described hijackings, burglaries, fixed basketball games, airport scams, and importantly, killings carried out by Burke's crew. Among those accounts was the story of what had been done to William. Agents, some of whom had handled William's file when he was alive, listened intently. They already knew the outline. A Gambino soldier had gone missing after an argument with men tied to the Lucchese family. Now they heard the missing pieces: the insult at the welcome home party, the ambush in the bar, the drive with the body in the trunk, the burial, and later exhumation. Hill's details matched certain older bits of information: dates, locations, known ownership of properties in ways that, to investigators, lent credibility to his story. Still, they faced legal limits. Hill's testimony came years after the fact. There were no physical remains, no forensics, no surviving crime scene. Burke and DeSimone could not be cross-examined about it in a courtroom. DeSimone was gone, and Burke already faced other serious charges. Prosecutors chose to use the William episode not as the centerpiece of a murder case, but as part of a broader mosaic showing Burke's capacity for violence and the climate of fear around him. As Hill moved from debriefing rooms to witness stands, his stories reached beyond court transcripts. Journalist Nicholas Pileggi interviewed him extensively and turned his recollections into a book, Wise Guy, published in 1985. In its pages, William appeared as Billy Batts, the made man whose return from prison set off one of the book's most dramatic sequences. Pileggi changed some names and compressed timelines, as non-fiction writers often do to keep a narrative moving, but he stayed roughly close to the structure of Hill's account. In that telling, the scene at the suite and the fatal attack became turning points in Hill's own life examples he used to illustrate how casual and sudden lethal decisions could be in Burke's world. A few years later, director Martin Scorsese adapted Wise Guy into a film that reached a far wider audience. On screen, the character based on William, played by actor Frank Vincent, embodied a certain old-school wise guy, neatly dressed, confident, mixing humor with a chilly undertone. The argument over shining shoes, the smiling insult, the later ambush in a bar all were depicted in vivid detail, anchored by Hill's narration. For millions of viewers, that movie scene became their first and only exposure to William's story. Billy Batts turned into a shorthand reference in popular culture, quoted and parodied, detached from the real human being whose life had begun in a crowded Brooklyn tenement decades earlier. The complex web of his actual crimes, years of gambling operations, loan sharking, narcotics involvement, cargo schemes shrunk in public memory to that single violent episode. The dramatization, by necessity, took liberties. The timeline was tightened. Names were streamlined. Conversations were scripted. The film could not convey, in a few minutes, the full texture of his life, his childhood, his slow rise in the Gambino structure, his federal case, his time behind bars, his relationships with people like Carmine Fatico and John Gotti. It also could not show the quieter, less cinematic harm caused by his activities. The borrowers cornered in back rooms, the small businesses drained of cash by protection payments, the families damaged by the heroin he had helped move. Yet oddly, the film did preserve one truth about his end that law enforcement agents and historians consider important. He died not at the hands of the police, or as a result of a public shootout, but because of a private decision inside the underworld, a mix of bruised ego, disrespect, and disregard for internal rules. That emphasis, on how dangerous it could be even for insiders who believed they were protected, resonated with people who understood the history behind the fiction. Back in the real world, as the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds unfolded, the organizations William had served were changing sharply. Major RICO cases hit all 5 New York families. Wiretaps from clubhouses in Little Italy, Brooklyn, and Queens captured bosses and captains discussing money, violence, and internal discipline. Undercover operations targeted everything from construction unions to waster removal contracts. The Gambino Group, led by Paul Castellano after Carlo Gambino's death, and then seized by John Gotti in a bloody power shift, came under intense spotlight. Gotti, unlike his predecessor, embraced public attention. He stood on courthouse steps in expensive coats, smiled for cameras, and seemed to beat case after case in the 1,980 seconds, earning the nickname the Teflon Don. In some of those early trials, prosecutors introduced evidence about older killings and disappearances to illustrate how ruthlessly the family enforced its interests. William's case rarely appeared by name in those big public trials, but the pattern it represented, members disappearing after internal disputes, no bodies found, was part of the backdrop. Agents testifying about Gambino methods could point to multiple instances in which a man in good standing simply vanished and was presumed dead. Bentvena was one of those examples in their internal briefing books. On the Lucchese side, Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke also fell. Vario was convicted on federal charges, including fraud and extortion, and died in prison. Burke was eventually convicted of murder in a separate case and spent the rest of his life behind bars, dying in 1996. None of these convictions came directly from William's killing, but the same web of evidence and informant testimony that had brought his story to light also helped sink the men around him. By then, the neighborhoods that had shaped his early years were changing. Immigrant families who once saw association with local wise guys as a path up had more options. Their children went to college, moved to the suburbs, entered mainstream professions. New immigrant groups replaced the old in many Brooklyn and Queens blocks, bringing their own struggles and, sometimes, their own criminal issues. The Italian-American street mafia that had dominated mid-century news no longer held the same grip. In that shifting landscape, William's name lived on in smaller ways. A few older residents would say, "I knew his people," or "My cousin used to work at his bar." Retired detectives might mention him when giving talks about organized crime history. True crime writers would add a section on him in books about Gotti, Burke, or the Lufthansa case. Online, his name began appearing in discussion forums where people dissected mob history, trading links to FBI documents and clips from movies. What emerges from all those retellings is a picture that is neither pure legend nor fully complete. On one hand, his real offenses are clear. He took bets and ran unlicensed gambling, advanced high-interest loans backed by threats, used fear to collect debts, helped arrange the movement of heroin that damaged countless lives, and took a key role in the money-making engine of the Gambino underworld. On the other, much about his inner life remains unknown. What he thought in his cell at night, whether he ever regretted the path he chose, how he felt walking into that Queen's bar for his welcome home party, unaware of what waited weeks later. If there is a lesson in the arc of his life, it sits in that contrast between outward success and inward risk. To many young men in mid-century Brooklyn, someone like William looked like he had made it. Steady cash, respect on the corner, influence in neighborhood disputes, a sense that he answered to no boss in an office tower. Yet every gain came attached to hidden costs. Lodge enforcement attention, enemies nursing grudges, dependence on an organization that could turn on even its own. His final chapter shows how thin the shield of that organization could be. The same code that told him to keep silent in court, expecting protection in return, could be broken by one impulsive man from a neighboring crew. The same network that had backed his gambling and narcotics enterprises could not stop a sudden, unapproved attack in a room full of supposed friends. In the world he helped build, power was always conditional, and loyalty always subject to someone else's decision. Decades after his disappearance, the folder with his name still sits in an archive, one file among thousands documenting the rise and decline of organized crime in New York. The paper inside cannot capture his voice or his presence in a room, but it can trace the outline of what he did and what was done to him. It shows a boy from a struggling immigrant family who entered street rackets, became part of a powerful criminal structure, committed a long list of offenses, and was ultimately swallowed by the same violent environment he had served. By the time the last of the big cases against the old New York families worked their way through the courts, most of the people who had known William in life were gone or very old. His file sat in storage, his name turned up now and then on television or in a book, but the living memory of him, the sound of his voice, the way he walked into a room faded with each passing year. If you wind the story back and look at it whole, though, a pattern stands out clearly. He started as a child of poor Italian immigrants in Brooklyn, in a time when the city was crowded, work was scarce, and discrimination was open. The streets he played on were also classrooms. He watched which men had money, which men people stepped aside for, which problems got solved with a phone call from someone at a social club instead of from the police. The idea that there was a separate unofficial power structure, right there in his neighborhood, was something he absorbed early. From small errands carrying messages, keeping lookout outside card games, he moved up to handling bets and picking up money. None of it came with a legal paycheck or insurance, but it put bills in his pocket faster than a regular job ever could. That taste of fast cash and respect made a deep impression. When he saw older guys in good suits, not sweating on factory floors, he understood exactly what kind of life they were offering. As he stepped deeper into that world, his behavior followed a script that had been playing in New York for years. He joined in illegal gambling operations, helped run unlicensed card rooms, advanced high-interest loans to people who had run out of options, and enforced repayment with the unspoken threat of harm. He learned how to lean on a debtor just enough to make payment seem like the only reasonable choice, while keeping things quiet enough that the police had a hard time building a case. Later, he put money and energy into moving narcotics, particularly heroin, at a time when that trade was transforming neighborhoods across the city. He wasn't a street seller, but he helped make sure shipments came in and were distributed. The heroin he had a hand in moving did not stay abstract. It ended up in veins, in tenement stairwells, in public bathrooms, in the lives of people who often started with casual use, and ended with everything else in their lives crumbling around that addiction. For those choices, he eventually went to federal prison. The law saw the heroin conspiracy as a serious offense, worthy of a heavy sentence, and he served roughly 6 years. In doing so, he followed the unwritten rules of his circle. He did not testify, did not cut a deal, did not blame others to save himself. That silence cost him time, but it bought him standing in the Gambino structure. When he came home, men in his world saw him as someone who had stood up. The organization welcomed him back. He settled again into gambling and loans, meeting bookmakers, giving credit, making collections. He planned to re-establish himself around bars and clubs in Queens. To him, that return must have felt like proof that his way of life was durable. He had taken a fall, but the structure was still there, waiting for him. Yet the very environment that made his return possible also carried a constant risk that had little to do with courts or police. The underworld depended on codes about respect and rank. Men under that code were supposed to know exactly where they stood and how to address those above them. At the same time, it was full of men with quick tempers, wounded pride, and sometimes heavy drinking or drug habits. Where those traits met, danger could appear in an instant. The sequence that led to his death was born from that intersection. At a party meant to honor his release, in a bar run by men from another crime family's orbit, he made a remark about younger days about someone having shined shoes for him. Perhaps he meant it as a joke, or as a rough-edged affectionate memory. To Tommy DeSimone, a volatile younger associate already proud of his violent reputation, it registered as a humiliation. In a legal setting, an insult in a bar means little. In William's world, in front of the wrong audience, it could mean a lot. Tommy refused to let it go. Within days, he and Jimmy Burke, another powerful Lucchese associate, used their control over that same bar to set up a situation where William would be isolated and caught off guard. Hill's later account, supported in outline by what investigators already suspected, describes an attack launched suddenly, without authorization from the Gambino command. For William, who had spent decades believing that his formal status as a made man gave him a kind of shield inside that universe, the shock would have been as devastating as the physical blows. The rules he had lived by could not protect him in that moment. The aftermath followed a familiar underworld script: a concealed crime scene, a body moved to a hidden burial site, later dug up and hidden again. His family never saw him again. His official status switched, in police files, from active subject to missing presumed dead. There was no trial specially devoted to his killing. No headline announcing justice in his name. Any underworld response came through opaque channels, likely including the later disappearance of DeSimone, that did nothing to comfort the people who had loved him outside the life. When the story eventually came out, it did so for reasons that had nothing to do with him personally. Henry Hill cooperated to save himself and his own family from the fate he had watched befall others. In the process of explaining who Jimmy Burke was, how Lucchese rackets operated, and what Lufthansa had meant, he also explained what had been done to William. The man who had once been careful to keep his dealings in shadow was pulled into the light as one episode in someone else's confession. That is one of the ironies of his life. For decades, he had taken care to stay low-key. He wasn't a flamboyant gangster seeking TV cameras. He dressed neatly, spoke quietly, cultivated a reputation as steady rather than spectacular. His biggest crime on paper, the heroin conspiracy, drew little public attention compared to the noisy trials of top bosses. His gambling and loan work operated mostly in back rooms and whispered conversations. Ordinary newsreaders in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds would not have known his name at all. But after he died, his story crossed into public awareness in a loud, stylized way. The book and film that used Hill's memoir as a spine turned him into a recognizable character. For viewers, that on-screen version became the truth, even where it compressed events or adjusted dialogue. Children and grandchildren of people who might once have passed him in a real bar saw him instead in a movie theater, without necessarily realizing there had been a real person behind the portrayal. For historians and criminologists, his significance lies less in that dramatization and more in how neatly his life traces the evolution of American organized crime. In him, you see, a boy from an immigrant ghetto drawn to local toughs, because they represented power outside a system that seemed stacked against his family. A teenager and young adult who learned illegal trades, gambling, loans, quiet intimidation as if they were crafts, picking up techniques from older men. A middle-aged man who shifted into higher a profit, higher a risk narcotics distribution as global drug flows changed, illustrating how traditional gangs adapted to new illegal markets. A loyal member who accepted prison as an occupational hazard, believing his silence would earn him security and support. And finally, a victim of an unauthorized killing that showed how brittle the internal rules of that world could be when confronted with ego and anger. The crimes he took part in left damage much broader than his own fate. Gamblers caught in his web often borrowed to chase losses and ended up losing homes, marriages, or jobs. People who turned to him for loans when banks refused found themselves on a treadmill of never-ending interest payments. Victims of the heroin trade he joined suffered ruined health, broken family ties, and, in many cases, early death. By the time he himself was killed, he had already contributed to a long chain of harm stretching back decades. At the same time, his story helps explain why such a life continued to attract people. For much of his adulthood, he experienced the visible rewards of that path. Money in his pocket, deference in his neighborhood, connections that could make problems vanish with a phone call. Compared with a low-wage job with little future, the underworlds offer fast cash, a sense of belonging, a clearly defined role was powerful. Many of his peers who chose more lawful routes struggled in quiet ways that never made the papers. He, for a long time, appeared to be winning. The real balance sheet only came into view at the end. He died violently in middle age, with no chance to retire comfortably. No opportunity to see grandchildren grow up. The men who arranged his killing did not gain lasting security from it. One vanished into his own presumed grave. Another spent his last years in prison, dying there. The organization he had served so faithfully came under such pressure from law enforcement that, within a generation, it could no longer offer the same promise of untouchable power it once had. For his relatives outside the life, his choices brought a mix of benefits and pain. They might have lived in a nicer apartment or eaten better because of his earnings. But they also had to endure constant uncertainty, quiet stigma, and, at the end, the trauma of unexplained loss. Children and nieces or nephews grew up with a shadow story, that an uncle or father had been in with those people and then never came back. Some rejected that legacy entirely. Others, for a time, felt its pull before stepping away. Looking back from today, with information about his world far more public than it ever was while he lived, his story functions as a cautionary tale. It shows how a life that looks glamorous on the outside nightclubs, expensive clothes, a nickname whispered with respect, rests on sustained lawbreaking and on harming others. It shows how easily people who believe they are protected by their status can be betrayed by the very culture they helped maintain. And it shows how quickly all the visible benefits can disappear, leaving only a line in an old file and fragmented memories in the minds of a shrinking circle of people. If someone were to walk through the parts of Brooklyn and Queens where he once moved, they would see traces of his era only in small details. An old social club now turned into a legitimate cafe, a bar under new ownership where no one mentions what used to happen in the back room, an elderly man on a stoop who, if pressed, might say, "We had guys here once, real guys," and then fall quiet. The city has changed. The patterns of crime have changed with it. New types of fraud, cybercrime, and international trafficking have replaced, in many ways, the old neighborhood gambling dens. But the underlying dynamics William's life illustrates how people respond to limited opportunity, how they're drawn to quick, outside civ rules power, and how those choices ripple outward remain relevant. His personal story comes to rest, finally, in a kind of unresolved space. There was no public reckoning focused solely on his death, no jury that weighed the evidence in his individual case, no formal declaration of what, exactly, happened in his final hours. What we have is a combination of law enforcement records, one major witness's account, underworld rumor, and the broad patterns that match his disappearance to many others of the same era. From all of that, a coherent outline emerges. A man who committed serious, sustained crimes over many years, who trusted a criminal organization more than he trusted the law, and who, in the end, was let down by that organization's inability or unwillingness to fully protect him. In the long history of New York's underworld, his name is one among many, but his path is sharply drawn. It is the path of someone who embraced that life without illusion about what it required and paid the ultimate price that such a life risks. Somewhere in an archive box, his file closes with a simple final notation: missing, presumed dead, believed victim of organized crime homicide. That bureaucratic phrase is a far cry from the noisy bars, crowded tenements, smoky clubs, and tense backroom meetings that filled his decades on the street. Between those dry words and the vivid reality of the life they summarize lies the true measure of William Billy Batts, Bentvena's story, a real complicated man whose choices, crimes, and end can still be traced, even if the exact place where he fell has long since been covered over and forgotten. And as the night settles once more, we leave behind the shadowed world of Billy Batts, a man whose legacy still echoes through alleyways, back rooms, and whispered conversations among those who remember the old ways. His story, like so many from the silent empires, reminds us how fast respect can rise and how quickly it can turn into danger. If you enjoyed drifting through this tale, make sure to like the video, drop your city and listening time in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss another quiet journey into the underworld. Now rest easy, breathe slow, and let the echoes of the past fade softly into the night.